At my retirement party, my daughter gave me an envelope when I was giving a speech. When I opened it, she wrote, 99 reasons why you are the worst dad ever. My wife laughed, and everyone there mocked me. I didn't smile. I made a call, and what happened next shocked everyone. I will tell you everything. Before then, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Richard Hale. I was 65 years old that night, and it has been just over 3 years since it happened, though the distance hasn't softened the clarity. If anything, time polished the memory into something sharper and cleaner. The retirement party was meant to be a closing bracket on 41 years of work, the kind of event people use to signal continuity and gratitude. I had practiced a short speech, nothing sentimental, just acknowledgement and thanks. I believed, genuinely, that this moment marked stability, proof that I had built something steady at work and at home, and that I was stepping away with dignity intact. The envelope appeared while I was still speaking. My daughter stood up from her table and walked toward the small stage with a smile that read as performative even then. She hugged me briefly, tight enough for the audience to coo, loose enough to feel impersonal. She placed the envelope into my hand and whispered, "Read it now. It's important." The room leaned in. I remember the sound of silverware settling and chairs creaking as attention narrowed. I opened it calmly, expecting a letter, maybe a joke, something ceremonial. Instead, I saw the first line written in thick black ink. 99 reasons why you are the worst dad ever. I didn't react immediately. I scanned further down the page, enough to confirm the theme without reading each line. The accusations were exaggerated, theatrical, curated for effect rather than truth. The room began to laugh before I looked up, a rolling sound that grew once my wife laughed first, loud and unguarded, as if this had been rehearsed at home. That laugh landed harder than the words. I didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't fold the paper. I simply looked out over the faces, colleagues, neighbors, distant relatives. Watching them accept a version of me I didn't recognize but suddenly understood had been circulating without my consent. The hall itself was painfully ordinary. A rented community space with beige walls, a banner printed too cheaply, plates of catered food cooling under fluorescent lights. My company logo sat crooked behind me. This was not a dramatic setting, which made the betrayal cleaner. I had paid for most of the event myself. I had insisted on it, believing it was the right thing to do, a final act of responsibility. I had spent weeks making sure my daughter could attend, rearranging dates, covering travel, smoothing over past tension. Standing there, envelope in hand, I understood that the timing was not accidental. This was chosen because it would leave no room to object without becoming the villain. There had been signs before, patterns I had acknowledged privately but never named aloud. My daughter's milestones were celebrated loudly, my own were tolerated. When I missed her college recital because I was hospitalized overnight, it became a story about absence rather than circumstance. When she missed my award ceremony because it wasn't her thing, it was excused as personality. Holidays followed her preferences exclusively, and when I suggested alternatives, I was accused of rigidity. None of these incidents were explosive on their own. Together, they formed a quiet record of adjustment that always moved in one direction. I had mistaken accommodation for harmony. What I felt in that moment was not humiliation. It was recognition. Something aligned internally with such precision that emotion had no room to expand. I saw the envelope as a document, not an attack. I saw the laughter as data. My wife's expression, amused, relieved, almost proud, completed the picture. I realized that this wasn't rebellion or immaturity. It was consensus. I had been assigned a role long before that night, and my mistake had been believing retirement would change the script. Standing at that podium, I accepted that the version of me they enjoyed depended on my silence. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope. I thanked my daughter for her honesty, a word that landed neutrally in my mouth. I told the room I appreciated everyone coming and that I was grateful for the years we'd shared. My voice did not shake. The microphone picked up nothing unusual. Then I stepped down. No confrontation followed me. People assumed restraint meant agreement or shock. I walked past my wife without touching her shoulder and exited through the side door reserved for staff, a detail I remembered because it reinforced how accustomed I was to leaving quietly. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. I stood near my car and took out my phone. This was not a spontaneous decision, despite how it might appear later. I had been organizing files for months, noticing inconsistencies, correcting records, asking questions that went unanswered. I had documented transactions that didn't align, emails that contradicted statements, signatures that didn't match dates. I hadn't pursued them because I believed family loyalty required patience. In that parking lot, patience resolved into procedure. I made a single call and asked for the officer I had spoken to once before, giving my name and stating I was ready to submit evidence formally. I did not feel vindictive when I ended the call. I felt efficient. I sat in the car for several minutes without starting the engine, letting the noise from inside fade into a muffled background. The party would continue without me. Speeches would be revised, jokes softened, my absence explained away as discomfort or pride. That narrative no longer concerned me. For the first time in decades, my next actions did not require emotional approval from the people closest to me. They required accuracy. I drove home alone, noting how ordinary the streets looked, how unchanged the world felt. That night, I slept without difficulty. The envelope remained on the kitchen counter, unopened again. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. The list had already served its purpose. It clarified a boundary I had failed to enforce and confirmed that dignity, once surrendered too often, becomes optional to others. As I turned off the light, I understood that what had ended was not my career, nor even my marriage in that moment, but my participation in a version of family that required me to accept public erasure as humor. I was no longer willing to be misnamed for the sake of peace. I woke early the next morning with the same clarity I had gone to bed with, which told me the night before had not been an emotional spike, but a correction. I showered, dressed, and prepared coffee as if it were a workday, because discipline had always steadied me more than rest. The house was quiet, my wife still asleep in the guest room she had chosen months earlier after an argument she never revisited. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop, not to search for reassurance, but to organize. Files I had kept in parallel folders, bank statements, email threads, scanned documents, were already labeled. I didn't add commentary. I aligned dates and timestamps, letting chronology speak. The fraud itself was not dramatic. That was the part most people misunderstand later. There were no offshore accounts or elaborate schemes, just a pattern of small transfers justified as reimbursements, reimbursements justified by invoices, invoices created after the fact. It relied on trust more than cunning. My daughter had access because I had given it to her during a period when she claimed to be overwhelmed. My wife had encouraged it, framing it as support rather than delegation. Over time, the numbers accumulated into something undeniable. I had flagged it internally months before, not as an accusation, but as an anomaly that deserved explanation. None was offered. By mid-morning, I drove to the station I had visited once before under the guise of asking procedural questions. The officer recognized my name and did not appear surprised when I said I was ready to submit everything formally. We spoke in a private room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I handed over a flash drive and a printed index, not because it was required, but because clarity matters when outcomes will ripple outward. I did not editorialize or dramatize. I answered questions precisely, correcting myself when memory risked becoming inference. When I left, I was given a reference number and told what would happen next. The call to my lawyer came afterward, not before. I wanted the sequence to reflect my priorities accurately. The marriage had already ended in substance. Paperwork would simply align the record. My lawyer had handled corporate matters for me for years and understood my preference for restraint. I told him I wanted separation documents prepared immediately and that I expected resistance. He asked if I wanted to wait, to consider optics or reconciliation. I told him I had already considered them and that delay would introduce confusion where none was necessary. He agreed without commentary, which I appreciated. When I returned home, My wife was awake and scrolling through her phone, already rehearsing concern. She asked where I had been. I told her I had taken care of something important. She tried to laugh it off, referencing the party, suggesting my silence had unsettled people. I listened without responding, noting how quickly she moved to manage perception rather than address substance. I didn't raise my voice or present evidence. I told her a lawyer would be in touch and that she should begin thinking about alternative living arrangements. She stared at me as if I had changed languages mid-sentence. The next 48 hours unfolded with a predictability that surprised everyone but me. My daughter called repeatedly, cycling through tones, confusion, anger, accusation, apology, each less effective than the last. I answered once, calmly, and told her the matter was now procedural and that she should speak to her attorney. She accused me of overreacting, of embarrassing her, of choosing work over family, even in retirement. I told her I was choosing accuracy over performance and ended the call. I did not block her number. Silence carries more weight when it is voluntary. Third-party validation arrived quietly. A former colleague who had attended the party emailed me to say the moment had unsettled him and that the laughter had felt rehearsed. Another friend asked if I was all right and mentioned that my wife had been shopping the story the following morning, framing it as a harmless roast gone wrong. These were not alliances I solicited. They surfaced because clarity tends to reorganize the social field without instruction. I responded politely, thanked them, and declined further discussion. I didn't need a chorus. I needed clean lines. The house began to feel provisional. My wife moved through it carefully, as if touching objects might accelerate consequences. She alternated between indignation and pleading, insisting that families joke, that daughters rebel, that marriages endure worse. I did not argue with her framing. I told her the issue was not the joke, but the agreement behind it, the ease with which my dignity had been treated as communal property. I reminded her that I had asked, more than once, to be consulted when boundaries were tested. She said she thought I could handle it. I told her I no longer intended to. By the second night, the legal machinery had engaged fully. Notices were served. Accounts were frozen pending review. My lawyer confirmed timelines without embellishment. The police did not call with updates, nor did I expect them to. Processes have their own rhythms, and forcing them only introduces error. I slept again without difficulty, though the house creaked differently now, as if registering a change in occupancy before it occurred. I did not pack. I did not ask anyone to leave yet. I allowed the facts to do their work. What surprised me most was the absence of regret. I had expected some residue, nostalgia, doubt, the urge to soften edges, but those impulses never arrived. Instead, there was a steady awareness that I had delayed this alignment too long out of habit rather than conviction. The call I made in the parking lot had not been an act of anger. It had been an acknowledgement that I was done negotiating my worth in rooms that found mockery convenient. As the second day closed, I understood that the consequences now moving were not punishments I had imposed, but outcomes that had been waiting for permission to exist. The third morning began with movement rather than noise. I noticed it in the way doors opened and closed more softly, in the deliberate pacing of footsteps that had once moved freely. The house had shifted into a waiting posture, as if it understood that time, not argument, would decide what remained. I maintained my routine, rising early, dressing with the same care I had shown when I still had an office to report to. Familiar habits anchor authority, and I had no intention of letting this period feel transitional. I was not between identities. I was enforcing one. The arrest happened without spectacle, which felt appropriate. I was not present, and I had not requested to be. The call came from my lawyer confirming what I had already anticipated. My daughter had been taken in for questioning, evidence reviewed, charges filed. There was no satisfaction in the news, only confirmation. Consequences had entered the phase where they no longer required my participation. That mattered to me. I had done what accuracy demanded, not what emotion urged. The system now owned the outcome, and my distance from it was intentional, a refusal to confuse responsibility with vengeance. Back at the house, my wife received the news differently. She moved from disbelief to panic in a matter of minutes, her voice lifting, hands shaking as she asked questions I would not answer. She wanted to know what she could do, who she could call, how to fix it. I told her there was nothing to fix, only processes to respect. When she asked how I could be so calm, I told her calm was the only thing that remained once denial was exhausted. She accused me of cruelty. I told her cruelty would have been pretending none of this mattered. The backlash arrived shortly after, delivered through familiar channels. Relatives called to suggest compromise, to remind me of family unity, to ask whether I truly wanted to be responsible for this outcome. The phrasing was consistent, as if borrowed from a shared script. I listened without interruption and thanked them for their concern. I explained that responsibility had been present long before I acted, and that my decision was simply to stop absorbing it alone. Some understood. Most did not. Either way, the conversations ended cleanly, without raised voices or lingering promises. Logistics moved quickly once hesitation was removed. My lawyer coordinated access, assets, and timelines with efficiency that mirrored my own. Accounts were separated, documents copied, boundaries formalized. I did not weaponize information or threaten exposure beyond what the law required. I had no interest in humiliation as currency. The goal was separation, not spectacle. When my wife asked whether I intended to leave her with nothing, I told her the division would be fair and lawful, and that fairness would not be adjusted to soothe guilt or amplify it. By the end of the second day, the house felt less provisional and more conclusive. Boxes appeared quietly, filled with items chosen in haste rather than meaning. My wife alternated between apology and accusation, attempting to locate a tone that might restore leverage. She asked if I remembered our early years, if I could really discard decades over one incident. I told her this was not one incident, but the first time the pattern had been displayed publicly and endorsed without hesitation. Privacy had once concealed imbalance. Exposure had ended that privilege. What steadied me most during those hours was the clarity of sequence. Every step followed logically from the last, with no improvisation required. I had not escalated. I had proceeded. That distinction mattered. I refused to justify myself emotionally because emotion had not driven the decision. When my wife said she had nowhere to go, I told her that adults manage transitions even when they are inconvenient. I did not offer solutions, not out of spite, but because offering them would blur responsibility again. Boundaries lose force when padded. The night before she left, the house was quiet in a way that felt permanent. I walked through each room once, not to reminisce, but to register the absence of tension I had mistaken for peace. Objects remained, but the pressure to accommodate had lifted. I understood then that much of what I had labeled patience was actually erosion. Each concession had seemed small, reasonable, even kind. Together, they had constructed a life where my role was to absorb discomfort so others could avoid it. Ending that arrangement did not require anger, only acknowledgement. When she finally stood at the door with her bags, she asked if this was really it. I told her it was. She said she would never forgive me for choosing this path. I told her forgiveness was not mine to pursue when accountability was refused. There were no final speeches, no dramatic pauses. She left, and the door closed behind her with an ordinary sound that felt heavier than expected. I locked it, not as a statement, but as a habit, and returned to the kitchen to make tea. Later that evening, messages arrived from people who had witnessed the party and were now recalibrating their understanding. One admitted discomfort with the laughter, another apologized for not intervening. These acknowledgments mattered only insofar as they confirmed what I already knew. Public truth reorganizes alliances without instruction. I responded briefly, thanked them, and declined further conversation. Validation is useful, but dependence on it is not. I had reached a point where external agreement no longer determined internal certainty. As the 48 hours concluded, I sat alone in the living room and noted the absence of urgency. The reckoning everyone had warned me about had already occurred, quietly, without spectacle. What remained was adjustment, not grief. I understood that the next phase would not be about punishment or repair, but about rebuilding a life where clarity replaced compromise. The cost of my decision was visible and immediate, but so was its integrity. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with myself, and that alignment made the quiet feel earned rather than empty. I did not expect support to arrive disguised as consistency, but that is what it was. Her name was Elaine, and she had been part of our orbit for nearly 20 years, close enough to know the rhythms of our household, but distant enough to observe without obligation. She was my wife's closest friend, the one who had attended birthdays, holidays, hospital visits, and the retirement party without ever inserting herself into the center. On the night of the envelope, she had not laughed. I noticed that only afterward, replaying the room in my mind with the precision that follows irreversible decisions. At the time, I had simply registered her stillness as contrast. She reached out 3 days after my wife left the house. Not with a dramatic message, but with a short email asking if I was all right and whether I needed anything practical handled while things settled. The phrasing mattered. There was no curiosity disguised as concern, no attempt to extract a narrative. It was an offer grounded in function rather than sympathy. I thanked her and declined assistance, but I acknowledged the steadiness of her tone. She replied once more to say she understood and that she was available if that changed. Then she stopped writing. That restraint told me more than reassurance would have. Over the following weeks, our interactions remained minimal but consistent. She returned a book she had borrowed months earlier, dropped off a spare set of keys she no longer needed, and checked in once regarding mail that had been misdelivered. Each exchange was brief and factual. There was no triangulation, no commentary about my wife's situation, no subtle alignment seeking. In a period when many people were eager to declare loyalty or extract absolution, Elaine's refusal to perform allegiance stood out. It suggested a kind of integrity that did not require display, only maintenance. The first time we spoke at length was unplanned. I ran into her at a grocery store on a weekday afternoon, both of us lingering near the same shelf with the shared hesitation of people deciding whether proximity warrants acknowledgement. She greeted me plainly and asked how I was managing. I answered honestly but briefly. She nodded, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and said the party had unsettled her. Not because of the joke itself, she clarified, but because of the ease with which it had been approved. It wasn't spontaneous, she said. It was rehearsed. She did not say this to inflame me. She said it to confirm reality. That conversation did not resolve anything, nor was it meant to. It added context to a pattern I had already accepted. What mattered was that it came without expectation of response. She did not ask what I planned to do next or how I felt about my wife. She did not offer theories or advice. She simply named what she had observed and left it there. When we parted, she wished me well and did not suggest meeting again. That absence of agenda felt stabilizing, like standing on ground that did not shift under interpretation. Rebuilding began slowly and without ceremony. I reorganized the house not to erase memory, but to reflect current use. Rooms were repurposed, schedules simplified, obligations reduced. Elaine appeared occasionally at the edges of this process, never directing, only assisting when asked. She helped coordinate a contractor I trusted, recommended a local accountant when I needed a second opinion, and once sat with me in silence while paperwork piled up on the table. We did not talk about the past unless it intersected with logistics. Our connection formed through parallel action rather than shared grievance. What surprised me was how little explanation I felt compelled to provide. Elaine did not need convincing. She had watched the dynamic long enough to recognize its contours without dramatization. One afternoon, while sorting through documents, she mentioned that my wife had often framed my restraint as emotional distance. I never saw it that way, she said. I saw someone who listened longer than most people were willing to. The comment was not flattering. It was corrective. It reframed a trait I had been encouraged to apologize for as a form of discernment rather than absence. As months passed, the legal processes continued in the background, moving with their own measured pace. I did not involve Elaine in those matters beyond what practicality required. She did not ask for updates. Our interactions remained grounded in the present, oriented toward what needed doing rather than what had been lost. That orientation mattered. It prevented the relationship from forming around injury or rescue, which would have corrupted its foundation. Instead, It grew from mutual respect for boundaries, a quality I had learned to value only after its absence became costly. There were moments when the simplicity of our connection felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I was accustomed to relationships that required calibration, where silence was interpreted as withdrawal and calm was mistaken for indifference. With Elaine, silence was simply space. We could sit without speaking and part without explanation. That neutrality allowed trust to develop without acceleration. I began to understand that loyalty does not announce itself during crises. It maintains shape afterward. In that sense, Elaine had been present all along, just not loud enough to compete with performance. The shift in my internal landscape was gradual but unmistakable. I no longer felt compelled to justify my decisions or soften their edges for external comfort. Elaine's presence did not validate my choices, nor did it challenge them. It existed alongside them, which turned out to be more powerful. Through her, I saw that support does not always arrive as defense. Sometimes it arrives as witness, steady and unreactive, allowing consequences to unfold without interference. That kind of presence reorients power quietly, restoring agency without confrontation. By the end of that season, it was clear that something had changed irreversibly, though nothing dramatic had occurred. The house felt inhabited rather than defended. My routines felt intentional rather than compensatory. Elaine and I remained unlabeled, unannounced, and unexamined by others, which preserved the integrity of what was forming. I understood that the next phase would invite scrutiny and reinterpretation, especially as outcomes became visible. But for the first time since the night of the envelope, I did not feel braced for impact. I felt prepared to let the truth surface on its own terms. The reckoning did not announce itself with raised voices or dramatic entrances. It arrived the way most truths do when no one is trying to suppress them anymore. Through paperwork, calendars, and third-party confirmations that could not be argued into silence. The court dates were scheduled without urgency, yet everything around them seemed to rearrange itself accordingly. Friends who had avoided me began to reappear cautiously, no longer confident in the version of events they had accepted so easily. I did not correct them unless asked. By then, the facts were learning how to speak without me. The first public shift occurred quietly, through legal channels rather than social ones. Charges became formal, not speculative. Language hardened from misunderstanding to documented misrepresentation. The phrasing mattered. People who had once framed my actions as overreaction now recalibrated, careful not to be seen on the wrong side of inevitability. I watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. Reputation, I learned, is less about truth than about timing. When the record finally catches up, loyalty often follows the paper trail rather than the person. My wife attempted one last reframing when she realized the narrative was slipping. She reached out through mutual acquaintances, suggesting reconciliation, counseling, privacy. The implication was clear. If I softened my stance, the fallout could be contained. I declined without counterproposal. I had no interest in containment. Containment was what allowed the imbalance to thrive in the first place. When she finally contacted me directly, she accused me of destroying the family out of pride. I told her the family had been functioning as a performance, and performances collapse when the audience changes. The divorce proceedings moved forward with procedural clarity. Assets were divided according to law, not sentiment. I did not contest what was hers, nor did I concede what was mine out of guilt. Fairness, I discovered, feels cold to those accustomed to advantage. She told anyone who would listen that I had abandoned her when she needed me most. I did not dispute this publicly. Need, I had learned, was often defined by how much someone expected me to absorb without question. My refusal was not abandonment. It was a boundary that arrived late. The trial itself was brief and unspectacular, which felt fitting. Evidence does not require drama. It requires alignment. When judgment was rendered, there were no gasps or outbursts, just the quiet repositioning of responsibility where it belonged. I was not present in the room, by choice. I read the outcome later in a formal notice, noting how little emotion the language carried. That neutrality felt like vindication. The truth had been acknowledged without my needing to perform outrage or sorrow. It stood on its own, which was always my preference. Backlash followed predictably, though its tone had changed. Accusations softened into lament. People spoke of tragedy rather than injustice, as if reframing the outcome as sad might absolve their earlier complicity. I received messages urging me to be the bigger person, to consider forgiveness as a gesture of maturity. I did not respond. Forgiveness offered under pressure is not generosity. It is compliance repackaged as virtue. I had already chosen a different measure of maturity, one that prioritized clarity over reconciliation theater. Elaine observed this phase without commentary, which I appreciated. When I mentioned the outcome in passing, she nodded and asked if I needed help adjusting schedules. That question grounded me more than congratulations would have. It acknowledged that consequences extend beyond verdicts into daily life. We focused on practical matters, travel plans, household projects, commitments that had been postponed during uncertainty. Through action, the future began to feel tangible again, not as a reward for endurance, but as a result of alignment. The most telling moment came unexpectedly, during a small gathering where someone referenced the retirement party as that joke that went too far. I corrected them calmly. I said it had not been a joke, but a statement endorsed publicly, and that its consequences were proportional. The room went quiet, not in discomfort, but in recalibration. No one argued. The truth had matured enough to be stated plainly without resistance. That was when I understood the reckoning was complete, not because everyone agreed, but because no one could plausibly deny it anymore. What remained was integration. I had to decide how much access the past would retain in my future. I chose minimalism, not erasure, but containment. I stopped explaining my decisions to those who asked out of curiosity rather than concern. I redirected conversations toward present realities. The old story, stripped of its emotional charge, lost its utility. It no longer served as leverage, cautionary tale, or moral referendum. It became context, useful, but no longer dominant. By the end of that period, I felt something settle that I had not anticipated, a sense of authorship. Not triumph, not revenge, but ownership of my narrative without footnotes or apologies. The reckoning had not elevated me socially, nor had it repaired every relationship. It had done something more durable. It had aligned consequence with choice in a way that could not be reversed. As I looked ahead, I understood that the final chapter would not be about what I had lost or proven, but about what I would no longer pass down. Silence mistaken for strength, and endurance confused with loyalty. The reset did not arrive with celebration. There was no announcement, no symbolic gesture meant to signal closure to anyone watching. It arrived the way stability usually does after disruption. Incrementally, through choices that stopped referencing the past as a justification. By the time the final legal documents were filed and archived, the events that once dominated conversation had lost their immediacy. They were no longer urgent topics or cautionary tales. They had become background context, relevant only when someone tried to resurrect them for leverage. I no longer engaged in those attempts, not out of fatigue, but because they no longer fit the structure of my life. Elaine and I moved forward without renegotiating what had already proven itself. There was no dramatic shift from proximity to declaration. Our relationship changed in the way seasons do, noticed only when you realize the temperature no longer requires adjustment. We spent more time together, not because we needed to, but because it simplified decision-making. Shared routines replaced coordination. Silence remained comfortable, but it was now accompanied by shared intent. When we discussed the future, it was framed in terms of logistics and alignment, not repair or compensation for what had been lost. The decision to marry was made one afternoon without ceremony. We were reviewing documents related to a property I intended to sell, and the conversation drifted naturally toward long-term planning. There was no proposal, no performance. We acknowledged that our lives were already integrated in substance, and that formalizing it would simplify matters rather than complicate them. The absence of spectacle was intentional. I had learned the cost of public gestures untethered from private alignment. This was not a declaration meant to provoke reaction. It was a confirmation meant to reduce friction. When the marriage became known, reactions varied predictably. Some expressed surprise, others discomfort. A few accused me of betrayal, reframing timelines to suit their preferred narrative. I did not correct them unless necessary. The truth did not require defense. Elaine had not replaced anyone. She had simply remained present long enough for clarity to emerge. The relationship was not born of rescue or rebellion. It was the result of sustained respect and consistent behavior over time. That distinction mattered, even if it was not universally acknowledged. What surprised me most was how little guilt I felt about moving forward. I had expected residual obligation, a sense of debt to the life I had dismantled. Instead, there was relief in recognizing that I had not abandoned anything that was functioning equitably. I had stepped away from an arrangement that required my diminishment to sustain others' comfort. That realization reframed the past more thoroughly than any argument could. I began to see moments I had once interpreted as generosity in a different light, not as kindness freely given, but as compliance learned early and reinforced often. The twist, when it became clear, was almost mundane. While organizing old files to digitize and discard, I found notes I had taken years before, documenting small inconsistencies and emotional patterns I had dismissed as stress or miscommunication. Dates aligned with moments I remembered as isolated tensions. Conversations I thought were resolved had simply been deferred. The envelope at the retirement party had not initiated anything. It had concluded a process already underway. The public humiliation was not a rupture, but a culmination, a moment when private imbalance could no longer be contained. That reframing changed how I understood my own role. I had not been blindsided. I had been trained to tolerate escalation without naming it. The clarity that followed was not sudden insight, but delayed acknowledgement, recognizing that removed the last trace of self-reproach. I had not failed to protect myself because I was weak. I had done so because endurance had been rewarded in my family narrative, while boundary setting had been framed as abandonment. Ending that pattern required more restraint than retaliation ever could. The generational reset became explicit when extended family attempted to re-establish contact on revised terms. Invitations arrived framed as peace offerings, often accompanied by language that suggested the past was best forgotten. I declined politely and consistently. Not all access deserves restoration, and forgetting is not the same as forgiving. Elaine supported this without urging or resistance. We agreed that proximity would be determined by behavior, not history. That principle guided decisions large and small, creating a life that did not require constant recalibration to accommodate unresolved dynamics. As time passed, the story others told about me lost its edge. It became less useful as warning or spectacle. New narratives emerged, shaped by absence rather than engagement. I did not attempt to influence them. I focused instead on building routines that reflected my values. Clarity over charm, consistency over performance, consequence over negotiation. These choices did not generate applause, but they produced stability. The quiet that followed was not emptiness, but space reclaimed. The final confirmation came unexpectedly, during a conversation with someone who had attended the retirement party and later apologized for their laughter. They admitted they had assumed I would smooth it over, as I always had. That assumption, stated plainly, clarified everything. My past had taught people what they could take without cost. My present taught them otherwise. The shift did not require explanation or enforcement. It required consistency. Once established, it held. Now, when I look back at the night of the envelope, I no longer see it as a moment of loss. I see it as the point where ambiguity ended. The laughter, the mockery, the silence that followed. All of it served to expose a truth I had postponed confronting. The call I made was not an act of revenge. It was a declaration of authorship. I chose accuracy over affection, alignment over approval. In doing so, I ended a cycle that would have continued unquestioned had I accepted the role assigned to me. That, more than any consequence that followed, was the real inheritance I chose not to pass down. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched silence be mistaken for weakness or boundaries mistaken for cruelty, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video so it reaches others who need to hear that clarity is not betrayal. Share it with someone who understands the cost of endurance and the power of quiet consequence. And subscribe for more true-to-life stories about family, loyalty, and the strength that comes from choosing self-respect over performance. See you soon in the next story.